within societies, there you want as many things to be privatized as possible. You want things where there isn't a conflict of interest between participants, where they can organize themselves because that's the most efficient way of doing things, which allows people to accumulate wealth most rapidly. But there are things within society that have fundamental characteristics, primarily due to information asymmetries and how it's hard for people to move geographically rapidly. So because you can't just like get up and move to new places very easily, it's a very expensive thing to do. And we have information asymmetries where not everybody is fully aware of what would make the best good or service for them or provide them something at the best price at any given point in time. Those are the kind of the constraints that we're operating within this world in. And sometimes governments have to intervene and provide certain services where we do have these constraints, which ultimately result in people taking advantage of one another through conflict of interest. Um, so I think that, we see this with monopolies, natural monopolies that emerge in governments that need to control some of these industries to remove that inherent problem. The bigger question, and I think that this is probably the hardest one for like libertarian type ideologies to answer, is the concept of externalities, and when those externalities are negative, how to control for a lot of that. And I think that's a pretty salient topic today with what's going on with in a pandemic. And I think that it's not to say that government isn't necessary, but in the long run, we can see that a lot of these issues, these natural monopolies, these information asymmetries, and these constraints get solved through technology as we evolve. Um, we are currently at the most information transparent environment we've ever been in the world today. And that's only getting better. And we should not constrain that, because that's the most important thing. It's much easier for people to respond and for consumers to organize against, organizations that are taking advantage of them when information is readily apparent. People can say what they want. So I think that with money, taking a step back to your point about the Constitutional Convention, that's a great example of when we created a system, we created a balance of powers, we created this transitive type structure. It's like rock, paper, scissors. Each point has a control over the other point. Nobody has full control over anything. And we created that system, and it was a trade-off. And we said, well, there are, we could have a dictatorship and you can run countries, and that's how it's been for most of history. And there's inherent moral hazard that it results in giving centralized authority power over a vast amount of wealth in people's lives and their labor. And we said we want to create a society that eliminates that. We created this genius concept, and we created this balance of powers, and it worked. And then we had the fastest growing capitalist society in history to become the largest economy and most powerful economy in the world. I mean, think about that. Think about how quickly the US grew under this system. Now, the system was much slower than a dictatorship. It's much harder for us to pass laws. And we said, okay, well, we will take that trade-off in order to not let leaders start to, appropriate our wealth from us over time. So that was a necessary trade-off that we took. And with money, you can see a very similar trend throughout history, where in antiquity, money was primarily decentralized. It's actually a very old concept. It's probably the oldest concept of money. People created money themselves, they stored money themselves, and they verified money between one another themselves. There weren't specialized party that were controlling any of these functions when we're talking about very primitive societies and localized groups. As we started to scale, and as organization became much more complex, centralization needed to occur in one of those three functions in a variety of ways. And we can see how society kind of trended that direction over time. And, the first thing to get monopolized was the centralization of production by governments, when people started to take advantage of money and dilute it. And then ironically, and this happened with each one, governments ended up committing the same crime when they were given control over it as well. Then it happened with storage of money, and we created banking systems, and then governments attempted to control those with central banking, and that's how that emerged. So we saw this trend in centralization of all these functions over time. And here we are today in the most centralized financial system in history. And it has inherent moral hazard. And people are taking advantage of us every day. People are taking wealth from other consumers. We have extreme wealth inequality. It hasn't been this bad since the Great Depression. And Bitcoin ties into all of that because it was the same concept that the founding fathers created when they said, okay, this got bad. And Bitcoin couldn't have been created, obviously, at that time because we didn't have the technology there. But now that we have the technology that we have today, we had a feasible innovation to say we can actually decentralize this as well. And we can create something in a system that's much more slow moving, that can't be controlled by anybody. And that's the trade off we're taking. We're going to say, okay, well, we don't want anything to change about it. And the Federal Reserve can change something about our monetary policy in the blink of an eye. But we're going to remove that benefit of efficiency because we don't want to trust the centralized party with control over our money who is going to, enact policy that will benefit them or their interests or their organizations at the cost of broader society. Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very parallel concept to a lot of things that have happened in history that have enabled freedom.